It all began in late September, when the mountains were already starting to be wrapped in a thin veil of cold, and the greenery was gradually giving way to dry, sun-scorched slopes. The North Caucasus at this time of year is especially harsh, yet strikingly beautiful. Narrow trails winding through the cliffs hung under a heavy sky, and the cold wind cut through to the bone. A group of 6 hikers had decided to climb to one of the lookout points located at an altitude of about 2,300 meters above sea level. For experienced trekking enthusiasts, it was a routine hike, nothing extraordinary. They walked slowly, stopping occasionally to admire the views, take photos on the edge of a cliff, or simply catch their breath. The wind howled through the ravines, tugging hoods from their shoulders and lifting dust and tiny stones into the air. The air was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and something metallic, perhaps from the nearby snowfields or just the rocks that were about to begin losing their warmth before winter arrived. As they approached the summit, one of the hikers looked up and noticed a large bird circling overhead. He figured it might be an eagle, common in this area. But when they reached the summit, their surprise turned into confusion. Perched on a ledge, slightly away from the trail and only a meter from the cliff's edge, sat a massive bird of prey. It wasn't moving. It didn't react to the people approaching or to the sounds around it. Its eyes were half closed, and its beak pointed downward. The bird looked like a frozen sculpture. Someone even joked that it must be a model. It was so unnaturally still. But after a few minutes, the eagle slightly moved its wing, shifted its claw, and turned its head. Alive. Real. But why wasn't it flying away? Why was it so close to humans, sitting in such an exposed place, showing no signs of aggression or fear? They watched it for a while, then continued on. The day was short, and the sun soon began to sink toward the horizon. The wind picked up, and the hikers hurried back to their campsite. That night, temperatures dropped below freezing, and the strange eagle was quickly forgotten in the warmth of conversation and food. But the next day, when another group of local hikers ascended the same trail, they saw the same eagle, sitting in the exact same place, with the same expression, in the same posture. Once again, no movement, no signs of hunting or flight. This time, the group paid more attention. One hiker pulled out binoculars and observed the bird closely. It looked thin, but its eyes were sharp, alert. Its wings were pressed tightly against its body, claws gripping the rock. It looked as if it was holding on with the last of its strength, but it wasn't giving up. As if something was keeping it there, rooted to that summit. Rumors spread quickly. By the morning of the 3rd day, photos and short videos of the eagle had already appeared on social media. People shared theories. Maybe the bird was injured or had lost its nest. Maybe something terrible had happened to it. Ornithologists commented that this kind of behavior was highly unusual. Eagles are solitary, freedom-loving creatures, constantly in motion. They don't stay in one place without reason, especially not in areas frequented by humans. Some guessed the eagle might be sick, but it didn't look ill. In its eyes there was no pain, only tension, as if it was waiting for something, or guarding something. Its presence on that peak was beginning to stir not just curiosity, but real concern. Why wasn't it eating? Why wasn't it flying? What could it see from that height that people couldn't? By evening of the 3rd day, a team of volunteers, including an experienced gamekeeper, decided to climb to the summit again. This time, not just to observe, but to investigate the rock more carefully. They brought binoculars, cameras, radios, and just in case the eagle was injured, a field animal medical kit. The ascent was difficult. The temperature had dropped below 0, and frost covered parts of the trail. When they reached the summit, the sun was already beginning to set, casting warm hues across the rocks. The eagle was still there, the same one, without doubt. It hadn't moved an inch. When people approached, it raised its head and looked at them, but showed no aggression or fear. It simply stared, quiet, direct, for a long time. There was something disturbing in that gaze, almost human. Not the look of a predator, Not the look of an animal defending territory, a look that seemed to carry a plea or an expectation, as if the bird wasn't simply perched on the rock, but standing guard, as though its task was to remain there, unmoving, until someone arrived, until someone helped. The rescuers, who joined later, were just as surprised. The eagle wasn't just guarding this spot, it was marking it, clearly, precisely, not a step aside, not a glance away. From that moment, it became clear. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a random episode with a wild bird. At this exact location, on this cliff, among rocks and freezing wind, something was happening that needed to be understood. And if the eagle hadn't left the summit for 3 days, if it had stayed in the snow without food or shelter, then the reason had to be extraordinary. People began examining the area, the rocks, the crevices, the cracks. Someone turned on a flashlight. Another started moving stones. Everyone was searching for the answer to the one question that now echoed louder than the wind itself. What was the eagle guarding? The people gathered at the summit felt a strange tension, as if nature itself was hinting that something important was happening here. The cold was intensifying, the wind howled through the crevices between the rocks, and the sky was slowly being covered with gray clouds. Despite the fatigue from the climb, no one was in a hurry to leave. Everyone felt the need to find something, to unravel this strange mystery, to understand why the eagle remained in this place, why it hadn't left for even a moment. Around the cliffs, there was a silence in which every movement seemed loud and significant. People began inspecting the area, first the nearby ledges and ridges, then the crevices between stones. They peered into cracks, shined flashlights into narrow gaps, and listened to the sounds carried by the wind. The eagle still sat motionless, occasionally shifting its head. It didn't look frightened, didn't try to flee, but also didn't show friendliness. It was simply there, as if performing a mission only it understood. One of the volunteers noticed a suspicious hollow in the rock just below the main plateau. At first, it seemed to be just part of the terrain, but upon closer inspection, it was clear that it went deeper, forming something like a narrow cave. Carefully descending, he illuminated the hollow with a flashlight but saw nothing. The darkness was dense and the passage sloped downward. He called the others, and within minutes, 3 people were already trying to widen the entrance by moving rocks and clearing ice. The work was hard. Fingers quickly went numb, breath turned into steam, but something about this place wouldn't let them stop. The eagle continued to sit, watching them closely. It seemed to be observing, monitoring, assessing whether the people were working quickly and correctly. When the entrance was wide enough for a person to squeeze through, one of the rescuers put on a helmet with a headlamp and carefully entered the crevice. The first few meters were easy, but then the path sloped sharply downward, forcing him to crawl. The stones under his hands were cold and damp. Icy air streamed from the cracks. The passage deepened, and after a few minutes the rescuer found himself in a narrow but somewhat stable tunnel where he could move crouched. He moved slowly, lighting the way, until he noticed something unnatural. On the ground lay a torn piece of fabric. It looked like a shred from a backpack or jacket, dirty, frozen, covered in dust. He stopped, reported back via radio, and continued further until he reached a narrow ledge that dropped into a pit. From there came a chilling moisture and a silence that rang in his ears. Next to the drop, a scrap of fabric again, and a little farther on, a metal carabiner. The situation was becoming more alarming. Above, the others heard his report and grew anxious. 2 people began preparing climbing gear so they could safely descend into the pit if needed. Everything happened quickly despite the cold and fatigue. In such situations, every delay could cost lives, even if the hope was faint. While they were preparing, one local resident who had joined the group shared that a few weeks ago, a pair of tourists, a man and a woman, had gone missing in this region. Their route had passed nearby, but their trail vanished in the mountains, and the search yielded no results. Officially, they were listed as missing, and the story had gradually faded from the news. But now, this information gained disturbing significance. When the second rescuer reached the ledge, they both examined the pit. Their flashlight beams barely penetrated the depth, but about 15 meters down, they could make out an uneven surface. The descent was possible but required caution. Using ropes and safety gear, one of them slowly lowered himself down. Upon reaching the bottom, he first saw empty bottles, then torn wrappers, and finally, a silhouette. A human body lay against the rock wall in an unnatural position. He didn't approach immediately, suspecting there might be someone else, and reported via radio. The second rescuer began descending. Together, they approached the body, a woman, judging by her clothing. Her face was partially obscured by a hood, but her features were distinguishable. The body showed no visible injuries. It looked as if she had simply lain down and fallen asleep. Nearby was a nearly empty backpack and another scrap of fabric. Searching the chamber, they found signs of a second person, footprints, another backpack, but no second body. It appeared the person had either left earlier or was elsewhere in the cave. Above, everyone held their breath upon receiving the news. The eagle still sat, never taking its eyes off the crevice's entrance. People were beginning to realize this wasn't just a coincidence, not just a quirk of nature. The bird had been guarding this place for a reason. It knew, sensed. Perhaps it had witnessed the moment when the tourists ran into trouble. Perhaps one of them died here, and the other managed to escape and disappear. But why did the eagle stay? What held it here for 3 days, motionless? There was no answer yet, but one thing was clear. The search wasn't over. Somewhere down there, in the depths of the rock, someone else might still be. And there was less and less time for deliberation. The wind grew stronger, night approached, and the anxiety that once felt like a vague emotion now became almost physically tangible. Night fell over the mountain summit suddenly, as if someone had turned off the light. The temperature dropped rapidly, and everything around froze in icy silence. The rescuers who remained at the top lit a small fire, trying to stay warm and conserve their strength. Fatigue pressed down on their shoulders, but the thought that someone might still be alive below, deep in the crevice, wouldn't let them rest. The eagle still sat motionless in the same spot, like a stone statue. Only occasionally did it shift its head, observing every movement of the people as if overseeing the entire operation. Those who had descended continued to explore the narrow stone chamber. One of the rescuers noticed a narrow passage in the shadows that led even deeper into the mountain's core. With difficulty squeezing through the tight space, he moved forward. Rock scraped against his clothes, the flashlight flickered across damp walls, and the air grew increasingly stale and heavy. Suddenly, in one corner, he spotted what looked like a fold of fabric. Approaching it, he realized it wasn't just a scrap, it was part of a jacket, and beneath it, a body, a second one, a man lying awkwardly in the deep shadow. It seemed he had tried to move further or turn back but had collapsed. Nearby lay an empty canteen and signs of desperate effort to escape. Scratches on the walls, shoe marks, broken stones. He had fought for his life, likely for a long time. The rescuers froze. Everything became clear. The couple that had gotten lost in this area had sought shelter in the crevice, hoping to wait out the storm. Perhaps they had gone too deep, hoping to find another exit. But the cold, exhaustion, and lack of food took their toll. The woman remained below, while the man, summoning his last strength, tried to crawl back, but failed. When they brought the body closer to the light, it became evident that he had a makeshift note tied to his wrist. A piece of plastic with scratched writing. It contained names, dates, and a few words clearly meant to explain what had happened. A farewell message. A note left in hope that someone would someday find them. Above, the wind howled louder. The people gathered at the entrance to the crevice felt a suffocating anticipation. When the radio confirmed the discovery of the second body, they exchanged glances. Everyone understood. Hope had run out, but one final mission remained: to bring the deceased home. No one said a word. The eagle, sensing that the mystery had been solved, rose to its feet for the first time in 3 days. It slowly spread its broad, heavy wings and walked to the edge of the cliff. It looked down toward the crevice, then at the people. It was a farewell gaze, not hostile, not frightening. Rather, it carried an ancient, almost human wisdom. Then it took flight. Its flight was unhurried. It didn't flee like a startled wild bird. It seemed to have completed its watch, its vigil. It had been observing, waiting, and would not leave until the truth was revealed. Now that it could go. The people stood in silence, watching as the eagle disappeared into the mist above the cliffs. In that moment, no one spoke, but each person felt the same thought. This was no coincidence. The bird had stayed for a reason, guarding the entrance. Perhaps it had witnessed the tragedy. Perhaps it had simply sensed that something needed attention. It felt as though, in this mountain, the paths of humans and nature had intertwined, and one life had helped another to be found. When the bodies were brought to the surface and placed into sealed bags, the wind, as if on cue, shifted and grew warmer. A light snow began to fall from the sky. The team started their descent slowly and carefully, burdened not only by the physical weight they carried, but also by the emotional load. In their memory would remain not only the horror of what they had seen, but something more, a sense that they had been part of a vast, unfathomable story, in which a bird guarded the peace of the dead and waited for those who would bring them home. The descent from the mountain peak took several hours. The fragile daylight had barely begun to illuminate the path when it started to fade again, giving way to early twilight. Every movement had to be made with extreme caution. Icy rocks, slippery trails, heavy gear, and most importantly, the stretchers carrying the bodies, which could not be dropped or damaged. The way down was not only physically challenging, but emotionally grueling. Everyone felt an unusual silence, as if it wrapped itself around each member of the group. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a silence filled with thoughts, heavy, like the load on their backs. In their minds played fragments of what they had seen, what they had felt, the eagle's gaze that had escorted them, and that message, scratched onto a scrap of plastic, a final testimony left behind by those who had vanished. When they reached the base of the mountain, others were already waiting. Several emergency vehicles, a couple of police officers, local residents, everyone knew the operation was nearing its end. But there were no cries, no panic, no noise. People stood in silence, holding back emotion. When the bodies were gently transferred to the medics, it became clear. The story that could have remained lost among the rocks had been uncovered. One of the rescuers, still holding the scratched note in his hand, quietly approached a police officer and handed it over. The officer read it, nodded solemnly, and placed it in a plastic evidence bag, not only as a detail of the tragedy, but as a symbol of hope, a sign that even in the final moment, a person still strives to be heard. In the following days, the story spread, not only through nearby villages, but to national news outlets. The media reported on the mountain tragedy, the rescue mission, the young couple who vanished without a trace and were found only weeks later, thanks to the watchful gaze of a bird of prey. But what mattered most was the public response. Strangers brought flowers to the base of the mountain, left notes, stood in silence looking toward the peak, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of the eagle soaring above. Debates emerged. Some called it a miracle, others a coincidence, and some believed it was nature itself intervening, showing that even in its wildness, it could reflect human empathy. The eagle was not seen again. A day after its last appearance, the bird vanished. Locals searched the skies, listened for its call, scanned the cliffs, but in vain. It had fulfilled its role, completed its mission. Perhaps it flew far away, to places without roads or voices. Or perhaps it simply faded into the mist, like the story itself, leaving behind only memory. Still, more and more often, especially at dawn when fog rises over the mountain, some say they hear its cry, loud, hoarse, echoing into the emptiness. At the place where the eagle had stood, a small wooden marker was placed. Nothing ostentatious, just a rough-hewn cross, a plaque with dates, and a brief inscription, "The Eternal Watcher." He knew. People came not as tourists, but as pilgrims to a place of quiet power. There were no conversations, no noise, just silence. Some left feathers, others left stones etched with symbols. It became part of a new tradition, not out of ritual, but in remembrance. Time passed. The rescuers returned to routine. Winter gave way to spring. The snow melted, and trails reopened. But in the minds of those who were there, a clear image remained. The bird guarding the mountain, the descent with the bodies, the way nature seemed to pause and wait for the story's conclusion. They didn't call it a miracle. They spoke differently. It was understanding. Nature understood that humans needed help. And this time, it didn't offer it through thunder or lightning, but through silence and the gaze of a living creature.